This is part 2 of the timeline from the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, to the Protestant Reformation. Now, there was a fourth crusade that started in 1202 AD, but it ended in 2 years. The Fourth Crusade was a Latin Christian armed expedition called by Pope Innocent III. The stated intent of the expedition was to drive the Muslims from the Holy Land, of the Muslim-controlled city of Jerusalem, and protect Christians living in the Holy Land, and uniting the Eastern and Western churches. Leaving Venice in 1202, the army proceeded to Zara, now Czar Yugoslavia, a Christian city then in Dalmatia which was a leading rival of Venice in the seafaring trade, sacked it, and divided the spoils among them. The Crusaders who participated in this looting were excommunicated for this crime against Christendom, but the Pope later revoked the penalty. Then, the Crusaders were diverted from the Holy Land to sack Constantinople instead. Crusaders marched on, and in 1204 AD, Isaac II Angelos, a Byzantine, gave the Crusaders the opportunity to seize and sack Constantinople, capturing it, and establishing the Latin Empire of Constantinople. The sack of Constantinople horrified all Christendom and lowered the prestige of both Church and Papacy, and from this outrage, the Eastern and Western churches separated. Constantinople was recaptured in 1261 by Michael VIII Palaiologos, a Nicaean emperor who reigned as the co-emperor of the Empire of Nicaea in 1259. He ruled the Byzantine Empire until the fall of Constantinople in 1453 AD. In 1213, Innocent III called for another crusade at the Fourth Lateran Council. Those under the direction of its military leaders were Enrico Dandolo, Doge of Venice, Philip the King, and Holy Roman Emperor of Germany, Boniface III, Count of Montferrat, and Baldwin, who was the first Latin Emperor of Constantinople. But the proclaimed objective, to drive the Muslims from the Holy Land, and of uniting the Eastern and Western churches, was abandoned. The Crusaders were in debt to the city of Venice for their transportation expenses and were forced to follow Venetian policies. The Fifth Crusade started in 1218 and lasted for 3 years. It was a campaign by Western Europeans to reacquire Jerusalem and the rest of the Holy Land, by first conquering Egypt, ruled by Al-Adil, the brother of Saladin. Innocent III died in 1216, and was succeeded by Honorius III, who immediately called on Andrew II of Hungary, and Frederick II of Germany to lead a crusade. Frederick had taken the cross in 1215, but Frederick did not participate in the crusade as promised. He hung back with his crown still in dispute, and Honorius delayed the expedition. In return for their lives, the Crusaders agreed to evacuate Damietta and leave Egypt. It was a bitter defeat. Although Jerusalem had been so near to them throughout the crusade, they were now forced to retreat with nothing. When the Fifth Crusade was over, it was a dismal failure, and unable to even gain the return of the peace of the true cross. The Sixth Crusade started in 1228 and lasted 1 year. The Sixth Crusade is also known as the Crusade of Frederick II. The crusade was a military expedition to recapture the city of Jerusalem. It began 7 years after the failure of the Fifth Crusade and involved very little actual fighting. The diplomatic maneuvering of Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, resulted in the Kingdom of Jerusalem regaining some control over Jerusalem for much of the ensuing 15 years. In the end, the Sixth Crusade successfully returned Jerusalem to Christian rule and had set a precedent, in having achieved success on crusade without papal involvement. A treaty was agreed with the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, Al-Kamil, to hand over the Holy City to Christian rule. So, the Sixth Crusade managed to achieve by peaceful means, what 4 bloody previous crusades had failed to do. The establishment of the Knights Templar in 1119 AD, were given papal recognition in 1229 AD. It was a Catholic medieval military order whose members combined military skill, with a monastic life, to defend Christian holy sites and pilgrims. The Knights Templar was a large organization of devout Catholic Christians during the medieval era, who carried out an important mission to protect European travelers visiting sites in the Holy Land, while also carrying out military operations. The Knights Templar set the outline, inspiring the militarization of charitable associations, like the Hospitallers, a religious military order founded at Jerusalem in the 11th century, and had its headquarters in Rome. The Hospitallers ran the Hospital of St. John, and only took up arms as a secondary requirement to defend those in their care. The Teutonic Knights, a chivalric order, emerged from the Crusades alongside the Hospitallers and Templars, and the found new orders of warrior monks, like the Order of Calatrava, which were four Spanish religious military orders who were the first order to take vows of perpetual war against the Muslim invaders. They became soldiers of the cross. And the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, were a Catholic military order established in 1202 during the Livonian Crusade. The Livonian order was a branch of the Teutonic or German order. Teutonic Knights were directly subordinated to the Pope, which means that it could be seen as a Roman Catholic army. The spread of Christianity, and the help and welfare of the poor and needy, were the two greatest achievements that the Teutonic order set out to do. The Seventh Crusade was from 1248 to 1254 AD. The Seventh Crusade was the first of the two crusades led by Louis IX of France, also known as the Crusade of Louis IX of the Holy Land. The crusade was conducted in response to setbacks in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, beginning with the loss of the Holy City in 1244, and was preached by Innocent IV in conjunction with a crusade against Emperor Frederick II, the Prussian Crusades, and Mongol incursions. Its objective was to reclaim the Holy Land by attacking Egypt, which was the main seat of Muslim power in the Middle East, under the leadership of As-Sullah Ayyub, son of Al-Kamil. The papacy used their crusading ideology against its opponents, and non-Catholics in war as well. The Liberian Crusades became fused with the Reconquista, and reduced Al-Andalus to the Emirate of Granada, by 1248 AD. The northern German and Scandinavian rulers' expansion against the neighboring pagan tribes, developed into the Northern Crusades, bringing the forced assimilation of numerous Slavic, Baltic and Finnic peoples into the culture of Catholic Europe. On the 8th of February 1250 AD, Louis lost his army at the Battle of Farisker, and was captured by the Egyptians. In 1251, the Shepherd's Crusade was a popular crusade formed with the objective to rescuing King Louis IX. It was after his release, Louis went to Syria where he remained until 1254 to consolidate the Crusaders. He stayed in the Holy Land for 4 years, doing what he could towards the re-establishment of the kingdom. After initial success, the crusade ended in defeat of the Crusaders in Egypt with most of the army including the king captured by the Muslims. This was considered the end of the Seventh Crusade. Michael VIII Palaiologos, in 1259, was the ruler of a Byzantine rump state in Asia Minor, who recaptured the city in 1261 AD, but parts of Greece remained under the Westerners' rule. The most heretical religious Christian sect popular in Europe was the Catharism, also known as Albigensian. Pope Innocent III believed that their heresy was dangerous to Christendom because it threatened its moral conscience. Therefore, Pope Innocent III launched a crusade against Catharism. The Albigensian Crusades against the Cathars provided the opportunity for the French monarchy to expand into the region. This was a military conflict fought in France. With its specific ceremonies and institutions, the crusading movement became a featuring element of medieval life. Often extraordinary taxes were levied to finance the crusades, and a crusader oath could be fulfilled through a cash payment which gave rise to the sale of unlimited indulgences by church authorities. The crusades brought about the union of monastic life with military service within the framework of a new type of monastic order, the military orders. The Albigensian crusade lasted for 20 years. In 1266, a period of civil war began. England was divided by civil war as King Henry III, who had been on the throne for 50 years, fought against some leading nobles, who wanted to limit his power. Noble rebels gathered inside Kenilworth Castle in Warwickshire with supplies and arms, preparing for battle. In the Battle of Benevento, as it was called, the army was led by Charles I, French Prince Count of Anjou, who defeated a combined German and Sicilian force led by King Manfred of Sicily. Manfred was killed in the battle, and Pope Clement IV advanced Charles as King of Sicily and Naples. The Eighth Crusade started in 1270 AD. In 1271, Sultan Bibar captured Montfort Castle, and in 1291, the Crusader city of Acre fell, ending the era of Latin Crusader kingdoms. Calls for new crusades over the next centuries were increasingly ignored, despite the renown in which Crusaders and the Holy Land were held in legend. The years 1272 through 1302 included numerous conflicts throughout the Levant, as well as the Mediterranean and Western European regions, and many crusades were proposed to free the Holy Land from Mamluk control. These include ones of Gregory X, Charles I of Anjou and Nicholas IV, none of which came to fruition. The major players who fought the Muslims included, the kings of England and France, the kingdoms of Cyprus and Sicily, the three military orders and Mongol Ilkhanate. The end of Western European presence in the Holy Land was sealed with the fall of Tripoli and their subsequent defeat at the Siege of Acre in 1291. The Christian forces managed to survive until the final fall of Rude, in 1302 AD. The end of the Eighth Crusade in May 18, 1291, Acre, the last Christian stronghold in the Middle East, fell to the Mamluks. And with the fall of Acre, the Crusader states including the Kingdom of Jerusalem, were absorbed into the Mamluk Sultanate. The last remaining Christian territory falls into Islamic hands. The Treaty of Tunis was negotiated between the Crusaders and the Hafsids. No changes in territory occurred, though there were commercial, and some political rights granted to the Christians. The Crusaders withdrew back to Europe soon after. In 1307, King Philip IV of France and Pope Clement V combined to take down the Knights Templar, arresting the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, on charges of heresy, sacrilege, and Satanism. Many of the Knights Templars were burned at the stake and others were sentenced to perpetual imprisonment. Although established in the Crusader states, the Teutonic Order focused much of its activity in the Baltic, where they founded their own state in 1226 AD. Mystics such as Meister Eckhart in 1327, and Thomas à Kempis, in 1471 AD, wrote works that taught the laity to focus on their inner spiritual life, which laid the groundwork for the Protestant Reformation. The Hussite Church, although the target of a crusade, survived beyond the Middle Ages. Other heresies were manufactured, such as the accusations against the Knights Templar that resulted in their suppression in 1312 AD, and the division of their great wealth between the French King Philip IV, and the Hospitallers. The papacy further refined the practice in the Mass in the late Middle Ages, holding that the clergy alone was allowed to partake of the wine in the Eucharist. This further distanced the secular laity from the clergy. The laity continued the practices of pilgrimages, veneration of relics, and belief in the power of the devil. It was in the 15th century that mysticism and the belief in witches and witchcraft became widespread, and by the late 15th century, the Church had begun to lend credence to populist fears of witchcraft. The late Middle Ages was marked by difficulties and calamities including famine, plague, and war, which significantly diminished the population of Europe. Between 1347 and 1350, the Black Death killed about a third of Europeans. Controversy, heresy, and the Western Schism within the Catholic Church paralleled the interstate conflict, civil strife, and peasant revolts that occurred in the kingdoms. In the 13th century mendicant orders, the Franciscans who had a higher value on poverty as an end in itself in following Jesus, and the Dominicans, who saw it as helping people to live simply and be free to preach and to love and trust in God, both lived very poor lives and earned their living by begging, were approved by the papacy. As early as the 13th century the papacy had become vulnerable to attack because of the greed, immorality, and ignorance of many of its officials in all ranks of the hierarchy. Vast tax-free church possessions, comprising according to varying estimates as much as 1/5 to 1/3 of the lands of Europe, incited the envy and resentment of the land-poor peasantry. Cultural and technological developments transformed European society, concluding the late Middle Ages and beginning the early modern period. In the 1370s, Oxford theologian English scholastic, philosopher and priest, John Wycliffe, later called the Morning Star of Reformation, started his activity as an English reformer. He rejected papal authority over secular power and preached anti-clerical and biblically centered reforms. His rejection of a real divine presence in the elements of the Eucharist foreshadowed Huldrych Zwingli's similar ideas. Wycliffe's admirers came to be known as Lollards. This led to a major theological movement in the 16th century of Europe called the Protestant Reformation. It stemmed from the Reformers' belief that the original Christian Church became corrupt. The Bible was withheld from the universal priesthood of believers and the Christian laity. The people had no right to the Word of God, that they may read for themselves. Protestants rejected the hierarchical system which put the essence and authority of the Church in an exclusive priesthood, and which made ordained priests the necessary mediators between God and the people. The Protestants believed that the Bible was the highest source of authority for the Church. This meant that the Catholic Church was in no way wanting to save souls, for they were more into gaining power and getting rich. Besides the schism, the Western Church was riven by theological controversies, some of which turned into heresies. John Wycliffe, in 1384, was condemned as a heretic for teaching that the laity should have access to the text of the Bible as well as for holding views on the Eucharist, that were contrary to church doctrine. In the 14th century, the English reformer John Wycliffe boldly attacked the papacy itself, striking at the sale of indulgences, pilgrimages, the excessive veneration of saints, and the moral and intellectual standards of ordained priests. To reach the common people, he translated the Bible into Venerable English and delivered sermons in English, rather than Latin. He strongly advocated his reformist Bohemian religious denomination. John Wycliffe, after his death, his remains were dug up in 1428, burned and thrown into the swift river. His teachings spread to Bohemia where they found a powerful advocate in the religious reformer, John Huss, who was very much influenced by John Wycliffe's writings. Beginning in the first decade of the 15th century, John Huss, a Catholic priest, Czech reformist, and professor, founded the Hussite movement and started two of the major heretical movements of the later Middle Age. He too was excommunicated and became a martyr. He was burned at the stake in Bishopric of Constance, in 1415 AD, by secular authorities for unrepentant and persistent heresy. After his execution, a revolt erupted among the Hussites. The execution of Huss as a heretic led directly to the Hussite Wars, a violent expression of Bohemian nationalism that was suppressed with difficulty by the combined forces of the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. Later theological disputes caused a split within the Hussite movement. Utriquists maintained that both bread and wine should be administered to the people during the Eucharist. Another major faction were the Taborites, who opposed the Utriquists in the Battle of Lapani during the Hussite Wars. The Hussites defeated 5 continuous crusades proclaimed against them by the Pope. There were 2 separate parties among the Hussite movement, moderate and radical movements. Both moderate and radical Hussites was increasingly persecuted by Catholics and Holy Roman Emperor's armies. Other smaller regional Hussite branches in Bohemia included Adamites, Arabites, Orphans, and Progers. Tensions arose as the 30 Years' War reached Bohemia in 1620 AD, Lollardy in England and Hussites in Bohemia. The Bohemian Revolt was a precursor of religious civil war in Germany in Luther's time. The Hussite Wars concluded with the victory of Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, his Catholic allies and moderate Hussites, and the defeat of the radical Hussites. The Babylonian captivity of popes at Avignon, in the 14th century, and the ensuing Western Schism, gravely impaired the authority of the Church and divided its adherents into partisans of one or another pope. While the papacy resided in France, the popes came under heavy influence from the French kings. The Petrarch Clement refused to move to Rome, and in 1309, he moved his court to the papal enclave at Avignon, where it remained for the next 67 years. This absence from Rome is sometimes referred to as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. Church officials recognized the need for reform, Ambitious programs for the reorganization of the entire hierarchy were debated at the Council of Constance in 1414 AD, but no program gained the support of a majority, and no radical changes were instituted at that time. In 1415, John Huss was burned at the stake for heresy, but his reform efforts encouraged Martin Luther, a monk, Augustinian priest, and theologian professor in modern-day Germany. It was he who initiated the Protestant Reformation. He nailed to the door 95 theses to the Catholic Church, and sent his theses to several bishops in 1517 AD. His theses protested key points of Catholic doctrine as well as the sale of indulgences, and along with the Leipzig debate this led to his excommunication in 1521. In the 14th century, a German mystics group called the Gottesfreunde, a democratic lay movement and forerunner of the Reformation, put heavy stress of holiness and piety, and criticized the Catholic Church and its corruption. Many of their leaders were executed for attacking the Catholic Church, and they believed that God's judgment would soon come upon the Church. Starting in 1475, an Italian Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola was calling for a Christian renewal. Later on, Martin Luther himself read some of the friar's writings, and praised him as a martyr and forerunner, whose ideas on faith and grace anticipated Luther's own doctrine of justification by faith alone. In Switzerland, Huldrych Zwingli, John Calvin, and other Protestant reformers further criticized Catholic teachings. These challenges developed into the Reformation, which gave birth to the great majority of Protestant denominations and also crypto-Protestantism within the Catholic Church. There are many denominations and sects that came forth from the Protestant Reformation, and it is most likely that each one of us have been affected or raised up in one church stemming from the Reformation, believing everything we were taught as being the truth. However, with many denominations, come many different views of doctrine, teachings, and beliefs, even though they all believe that the authority of the Scriptures in the Bible to be the sole authority and inspired Word of God. Me, myself, my family were called Baptist. So I grew up thinking that I belonged to the Baptist denomination. Though later in my years, I came to the knowledge that some teachings were not of the true teachings of the Lord Jesus and his apostles. Trying to find the truth, I joined other denominations. This is what really made me realize that all denominations are different in one way or another, meaning all have different views, rules, and regulations. I was once called a Baptist, a Methodist, a Seventh-day Adventist, and neither denomination satisfied my spiritual hunger. This is when I came out of the denominations and I call myself today, a Christian. The Reformers was a movement in an effort of men to remove themselves from a false and corrupt system, which they admitted was pagan and demonic in many of its beliefs, doctrines, and practices. The true Church of God had been hijacked in between the time of the Apostles until the Protestant Reformation. Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." Remember, Jesus built his church on the profession of faith God revealed to Peter. The profession that Jesus is the Son of God. This profession is definitely under attack today, but Jesus said, "The gates of Hades will not prevail against it." It was at the end of Jesus' ministry that he commanded his apostles to go and make disciples of all nation of peoples. They were to baptize them in the name of the Father, the name of the Son, and the name of the Holy Spirit. They were to teach them to observe all things that Jesus have commanded them, and Jesus promised to be with them always, even to the end of the age. The Protestant reformers brought the early church back to the direct approach of Scripture being a message from God. They rejected the Alexandrian system. The Reform movement made tremendous strides among the people, and when Luther left retirement, he returned to his home at Wittenberg as a revolutionary leader. The invention of printing with movable metal type increased tremendously the circulation of books and spread new ideas throughout Europe. The Protestant Revolution began in Germany by Martin Luther in 1517, when he published his 95 Theses challenging the theory and practice of indulgences. Papal authorities ordered Luther to retract and submit to church authority, but he became more intransigent, appealing for reform, attacking the sacramental system, and urging that religion rest on individual faith based on the guidance contained in the Bible. Threatened with excommunication by the Pope, Luther publicly burned the bull, or papal decree, of excommunication, and with it a volume of canon law. This act of defiance symbolized a definitive break with the entire system of the Western Church. In an attempt to stem the tide of revolt, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, and the German princes and ecclesiastics assembled in 1521 at the Diet of Worms and ordered Luther to recant. He refused and was declared an outlaw. For almost a year he remained in hiding, writing pamphlets expounding his principles and translating the New Testament into German. Although his writings were prohibited by imperial edict, they were openly sold and were powerful instruments in turning the great German cities into centers of Lutheranism. In Switzerland, Huldrych Zwingli, John Calvin, and other Protestant reformers further criticized Catholic teachings. These challenges developed into the Reformation, which gave birth to the great majority of Protestant denominations and also crypto-Protestantism, or hypocrites within the Catholic Church. Meanwhile, Henry VIII petitioned Pope Clement VII for a declaration of nullity concerning his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. When this was denied, he had the Acts of Supremacy passed to make himself supreme head of the Church of England, spurring the English Reformation and the eventual development of Anglicanism. Humanism, the revival of classical learning and speculative inquiry beginning in the 15th century in Italy during the early Renaissance, displaced scholasticism from its dominant position as the principal philosophy of Western Europe, and deprived churchmen of the monopoly of learning that they had previously held. Laymen studied ancient literature, and scholars such as the Italian humanist Lorenzo Valla from 1406 to 5147, critically appraised translations of the Bible and other documents that formed the basis for much of church dogma and tradition. Humanists outside Italy, such as Desiderius Erasmus in the Netherlands, John Colet and Sir Thomas More in England, Johann Reuchlin in Germany, and Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples in France, applied the new learning to the evaluation of church practices and the development of a more accurate knowledge of the Scriptures. Their scholarly studies laid the basis on which Martin Luther, the French theologian and religious reformer John Calvin, and other reformers subsequently claimed the Bible rather than the Church as the source of all religious authority. The worldly excesses of the secular Renaissance Church, epitomized by the era of Alexander VI in 1492, exploded in the Reformation under Pope Leo X, in 1513, whose campaign to raise funds in the German states to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica by supporting sale of indulgences, was a key impetus for Martin Luther's 95 Theses. But the Catholic Church would respond to these problems by a vigorous campaign of reform inspired by earlier Catholic reform movements, that predated the Council of Constance in 1414 on humanism, devotionalism, legalist, and the Observantine tradition. Thank you for listening. If this video has been helpful to you, please like, subscribe and share. Thanks.